Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and a producer of On the Digital Frontier, a webcast series offered by the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, which is focused on the people of Ukraine and their contributions to global technology innovation. Today is Tuesday, March 23rd, 2021. Our guests for this episode are Charles Whitehead, who is a co-founder of the AO Business Incubators in Ukraine, and also professor of business law at Cornell University in New York State. And Dominique Piotet, who is the CEO of UNIT.City, which is Ukraine's first and only, I'm told, innovation park. Welcome, Chuck and Dominic. How are you?
Great, thanks very much.
Very good. Thank you for asking.
Well, thanks for coming today on the Digital Frontier. So, Chuck, you've put together some thoughts about common misconceptions about Ukraine and its tech startups. So I'm going to turn this over to you to present those thoughts. And then after that, I'm hoping that you and Dominic can get into a conversation about them.
Sure. No, that'll be great. Dominique and I talk about these sorts of things fairly often, actually. And so, and the tech platform and the new economy in Ukraine. So I'll go through and sort of identify some of these misconceptions. I think Dominique will talk as well, and then we'll sort of do what we normally do, which is when we get together and chat about these things. It's kind of fun.
Sounds good.
So what I'll do is I'll share slides. Here's the deck, and really what I tried to do here was put on paper these 5 misconceptions, which really reflect kind of the things that I've heard about involving Ukraine. As some of you may know, I actually spent some time in the Soviet Union as a boy, so I've known Ukraine for most of my life, both in the Soviet Union and as an independent company. But I really became reacquainted with Ukraine about 5 or 6 years ago, when I began to return to lecture and to work with different people, set up the incubator. And I've got to tell you, I spoke with dozens, hundreds of people, both in Ukraine and outside Ukraine, the diaspora, folks who did business with Ukraine, and ended up learning a lot about not just how people work with Ukraine, but also their perceptions and, I would suggest, misconceptions about Ukraine and the startup world. And so I've tried to pick up on some of them here. And rather than try to sort of give you simply my impression of things, I also, just over the course of the years that I've been working in Ukraine, have collected data, various reports that have come out, and thought that I would also sort of identify those really to support why I think the misconception is in fact not held up, certainly not by my experience, but also not by the data in the area. So let's start off with the first misconception, and see if I can get the slide deck to move. There we go. And the first misconception is that Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt. Now, I want to be very clear about this. There's no question there's a corruption issue, not just in Ukraine, but in many countries. The view that was expressed to me, and I sometimes hear even today, is that Ukraine will never be able to pull itself out, that it's sort of on a downward trajectory, that corruption is an endemic part of the way business gets done in Ukraine, and so as a result, it's going to always be an issue. To be clear, I'm not saying that there isn't an issue. I'm really focusing on the hopelessly part. That there's no availability, no opportunity to improve on this. And my sense of things is that things are really changing. And it's supported by the Corruption Perceptions Index, which many of you know. So the CPI is considered to be sort of the global standard by which people judge corruption. Since 2012, so really over the last, 8-9 years, There are 180 countries that are in the CPI. In fact, not a lot of them have improved. 26 countries improved during that period. Almost an equal number of countries actually declined. The interesting thing about the CPI is that it's based as much as anything else on perceptions of corruption. I know some countries, in fact, have been trying to develop ways to sort of educate people on perception as one means to enhance their standing in the index. I've worked with a couple of countries that are trying to educate folks to understand that what they understand corruption to be isn't in fact real corruption. Certainly is one way to improve the CPI. I don't think that's what's happening with Ukraine. Ukraine, in fact, has increased by 7 points over this period. It had a score of 26. It now has a score of 33. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not to say that there isn't corruption in Ukraine. The point here is it's one of the very few groups of countries that in fact have improved over the last 8 or 9 years. In fact, during the 2019 to 2020 period, you'll see Ukraine was one of the biggest improvers. 3 of those 7 points took place between 2019 and 2020. And again, that made Ukraine, amongst countries that were improving, that small minority of countries that have improved, as being one of the leaders. And so, what I don't want to downplay is the need to address corruption. It needs to be addressed, I think, in a fundamental way. Even though the index is a perceptions index, I don't understand Ukraine to be focusing as much on perception as the reality of trying to minimize corruption. And you actually see the value of this over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years as Ukraine has improved within the CPI. The second misconception, and this is something that Dominique and I have spent some time talking about, and that is that serious VC investors just don't come to Ukraine. That yes, there might be some investments that have come in, but by and large, if you're going to invest, you actually have to leave the country. You have to maybe be bought by somebody else. But serious VC investors don't invest in Ukraine or startups in Ukraine. Now, this particular report comes out of the World Bank, and it deals with venture capital availability. And you'll see there's no question Ukraine has got, relative to Poland and Estonia, has got issues with access to venture capital. And there's a real need to improve access to venture capital in Ukraine. What's remarkable is that the growth trajectory in Ukraine over, in this case, the 7-year period, has actually outperformed Estonia and Poland. Keeping in mind Estonia and Poland as members of the EU, not surprisingly, are going to have greater access to capital. Ukraine, lower levels of access. But recognizing, I believe, the opportunities in Ukraine, the shift that's happening in Ukraine as new tech entities become more viable, the creation of an alternative economy, really a way of doing business in Ukraine that perhaps didn't exist 5 and 10 years ago. You see this overall growth rate, which actually exceeds Estonia and Poland. This chart, I apologize, it's a little harder to read. It was actually prepared by a friend of mine from Ukraine who recently graduated from MIT. And what I wanted him to do was to pull together data on the top VC investments in Ukraine through 2019, with a particular focus on investments from 2015 onwards, in other words, the more recent period. And he identifies the top VC investors using really just a general data source, right? This is PitchBook. It's a very well-recognized source here in the United States for venture capital investments. And what you'll see is there are 2 local investors, Horizon Capital and Dragon Capital, which invested over the period. But in fact, some of the world's largest venture capital investors have invested into Ukraine: Sequoia Capital, Y Combinator, and so forth. These are all world-class investors. They have access to investment opportunities around the world, and yet the size of the investments into Ukraine have been substantial. Could they be improved? Absolutely. And we'll talk about that perhaps towards the end. But the point here is that you do in fact have sizable and very experienced, these are smart money investors who are coming to Ukraine and are investing in Ukrainian startups. The third misconception is that Ukraine is not innovative, it's not entrepreneurial. Now, I have to tell you, this one really surprised me. And it surprised me because Ukraine is incredibly entrepreneurial, and the people I've worked with in Ukraine, both in our incubator as well as others, are quite innovative. I mean, all you have to do, this is a plug for Dominique, all you have to do is walk around UNIT.City. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, UNIT.City could just as well be in Silicon Valley or Boston, and you'll see the same sort of entrepreneurial spirit, the same sort of innovation that you would see in the United States. And so I wasn't really quite sure where this was coming from. I suspect part of it has to do with Ukraine as being perhaps more well known as an outsourcing country. And so, you know, Ukrainians are known for being able to, or the businesses in Ukraine, the outsourcing businesses, are known for, you know, not so much for innovation or entrepreneurship, but rather for implementing instructions that they might receive from clients outside Ukraine. But I will tell you, the World Economic Forum, this is the Global Competitiveness Report, sees something quite different. That when you look at the entrepreneurial culture in Ukraine, Ukraine scores really among some of the highest, some of the most entrepreneurial, the most innovative countries in the world. You'll see the rank there. The overall rank is 8. This is out of 141 countries. Israel is number 1. The one I find most interesting is the attitudes towards entrepreneurial risk. What you'll often hear is that Ukrainians are risk averse, that they are concerned about failure. I think there's a truth to this. Ukrainians are risk averse, but so are Americans. I was just talking this morning with a fellow in Cleveland, Ohio, that was talking about the risk aversion that startups have in Ohio. It's not necessarily specific to Ukraine. And again, in terms of the idea of you know, the ability or the interest or the willingness to accept entrepreneurial risk, Ukraine seems to do quite well. What's interesting about this is, if you look at other indices, you'll see that Ukraine actually doesn't score well at all. So the Global Entrepreneurship Index finds for risk acceptance, this is that third point, that Ukraine in fact has a really a serious weakness in the ability to take on risk. And so one question is, why do we see this difference? Right? We have the World Economic Forum report that suggests that Ukrainians and Ukrainian startups and the entrepreneurial culture is prepared to accept entrepreneurial risk. And yet we see this Global Entrepreneurship Index that suggests that risk acceptance is quite low. And to understand the difference, you have to do a little digging. Risk acceptance in the Global Entrepreneurship Index is defined not just in terms of individual willingness to take risk, but also whether the environment is conducive to risk taking. In other words, do you have unstable institutions? Do you have things around the startups that support risk taking, or alternatively, make it even riskier? And you might argue that one of the differences here is that Ukraine or Ukrainian startups are prepared to take risk, but the environment that they're in makes risk acceptance a little bit more difficult. In other words, being in Ukraine, the weaknesses perhaps with rule of law, some of the corruption issues, some of the institutions that could be there to support Ukrainian startups perhaps haven't fully taken hold. And as a result, you see a lower level of risk acceptance in the Global Entrepreneurship Index. Now, of course, this is changing. Right, you have the technology parks like UNIT.City. This is clearly an institution that supports startups. You have very recently DIA.City. DIA.City is a product of the Ministry of Digital Transformation. I mean, for that matter, there is a Ministry of Digital Transformation. These are all institutions that are looking to support entrepreneurship, and perhaps over time, we'll see an increase in risk acceptance, even in the Global Entrepreneurship Index. Fourth misconception, Ukraine is regional, its science is not global. Again, this was one of those ones where I was scratching my head. Everyone knows that in the Soviet Union, and certainly during the period immediately afterwards, Ukraine was considered to be really one of the brain centers of the Soviet Union. Some of the most innovative technology was being developed in the universities and research institutes in Ukraine. But the view steadily has been that Ukraine is not has become more regional, that some of the value that Ukraine brought to global technology, global science has diminished. And for this, I would direct you to something called the Good Country Index. Now, the Good Country Index gets calculated, I think, every year, maybe every other year, but relatively often. It's done by an independent group. And what they're trying to do is look at how a country, relative to GDP, right? So they're looking at resources that are available, how a country benefits the world outside that country. In other words, what contributions do they make to the world, to humanity, to the planet in general? And they use 5 factors in looking at science and technology to judge whether or not there is a net contributor, what the value is that someone brings to science and technology. They look at the number of international students in the country, journals, international publications, Nobel Prize laureates, as well as international patents that are issued. And so again, the idea here is based upon the size of the country, the GDP, to see what sort of contribution the country makes, not within its borders, but to the world outside that particular country. Ukraine is first. I suspect this is a surprise to most Ukrainians. It's actually not a surprise to me that Ukraine, in fact, is very much a net contributor. And I think one of the key themes here is Ukraine is able to do a lot more with less. That even though the GDP is smaller, it is nonetheless still a substantial net contributor to science, to technology, to the growth of that community, not just within Ukraine, but also beyond its borders. The last one I have heard often. I've heard this from people in Kiev, I've heard this from people in the United States, and that is Ukrainians are not very creative. Now, this one really does flummox me because I've never met a more creative group of people. But nonetheless, you sometimes will hear this. And again, perhaps it has to do with the fact that you have so much outsourcing into Ukraine. It's not viewed as being a creative aspect of the business. Rather, it's just something that you kind of do what you're told to do. But I've always found Ukraine and Ukrainian businesses, the people I work with, to be quite creative. In fact, if you look at the Cannes Lions Global Creativity Report, the most recent one, Ukraine is 25th in the world for receipt of the most creativity awards. These are awards for things like advertising, marketing, but also for films and other types of creative projects. To be clear, there are more than 25 countries in the top 25. There's a lot of ties. The point is, though, is that Ukraine stands out as being quite creative, certainly in the creative arts, as well as in other areas like media. What's more interesting to me is the Global Innovation Index. The Global Innovation Index measures, not surprisingly, the innovations in a country. And they do this by looking at patents, looking at other types of indicia of creativity. And what they find for Ukraine in terms of inputs, the sorts of things that help make the country more innovative, is that Ukraine scores fairly low at 71. In other words, there are real issues with rule of law, with the institutions that support Ukraine, within Ukraine, that support innovation. Again, some of this is changing. We UNIT.City, UNIT.City, the Ministry of Digital Transformation, but at least during the period that they were calculating this Global Innovation Index, Ukraine was viewed as being relatively low in terms of inputs. But take a look below at the outputs. Right? In other words, the indicia, the evidence of innovation. Ukraine goes from being 71 in inputs to being 37 ranked in terms of outputs. It does a lot more with less. And it does it in a way that really sets it apart. And you see this in this chart. This also comes out of the Global Innovation Index. The bright yellow are the countries that are low and middle income groups. So groups that are in the low and middle income GDP and sort of economic bracket. And you'll see that Ukraine is at the top of that group. The y-axis here is the output score. The x-axis is the input score. And if you go ahead and take a look at inputs versus outputs, Ukraine again comes in at number 1. It does a lot more within its GDP, its economic group. It is number one. It does a lot more than what others do, including others that are more economically well off. It outperforms them in terms of the innovation output relative to the support that these entrepreneurs and others have in creating this output. So, what does this all tell us? There is clearly serious and certainly from what I've seen, Dominique and I have talked about this, growing interest in investing in Ukraine. If you know Ukraine at all, you know that it is innovative. The people who are doing startups are entrepreneurial. They are very dedicated, quite ambitious. They work quite hard. Ukraine's science continues to be strong and continues to have global reach. And Ukraine is innovative. It's creative. It does a lot more, not just within its own economic sphere, its own GDP group, but also even with relative to countries that have more economic resources. It does a lot more with a lot less in realizing on the creativity of Ukraine's startups. And so one of the questions to ask is, why then do these misconceptions persist? Part of it may simply be that these are all relatively recent changes on the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, as the country has come to realize the need for a strong alternative economy. Part of it has to do, I think, with the people who work in Ukraine. And I view this as more positive than a negative. They tend to be very, very self-analytical. Gee, we're doing fine here, but we could be doing a lot better. And this goes to the focus on creativity, the focus on innovation, that the people who are involved with Ukrainian startups recognize that there has been real growth, but also recognize there is huge opportunity for further growth. I think part of it also has to do with the institutional problem in Ukraine. Rule of law issues regarding corruption, issues regarding the institutions that affect tech startups. But again, this is actually changing. We just have to continue to focus on this, right? Tech parks like UNIT.City, networks, platforms that support businesses like UNIT.City. I failed to mention the Ukrainian Startup Fund. This is a fund that provides grants of $25,000 or $50,000 to Ukrainian startups. It's funded by the Ministry of Finance. Again, these are all things that have come about only in the last 5 years. And we see the improvement in the corruption scale. We see Ukraine again improving relative to the world in terms of corruption. Again, not to say there isn't a lot of room, but that seems to be overshadowing a lot of the other real value within Ukraine, the innovation, the entrepreneurship, the creativity. And so to the extent we continue to focus on these more institutional issues, I suspect more and more people will begin to understand the real value that underlies them, that within Ukraine you now have a dramatic engine for growth and a dramatic engine for a new economy, for a new tech economy. That's it for me.
Chuck, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about these common misconceptions in Ukraine. Dominique, you've been sitting there respectfully and quietly listening to all of this. Mm-hmm. What do you think about Chuck's points? And in particular, which do you think is the most difficult misconception to overcome?
Well, I mean, Chuck and I, we do spend a lot of time discussing all this, and we've been doing this for at least the past 18 months. So we mostly agree on this. But I'm going to tell you, I would like to elaborate on 2 things, because I think those are 2 very important points. The first one is a story that I'm going to share with you. When I moved to Ukraine 18 months ago, 2 or 3 months after I moved, it was Davos time. And back in the day, you know, when we had physical events. And so there is something that was very successful in Davos, the Ukraine House Davos, that actually UNIT.City decided to sponsor. And I went and I did spend a week in Davos and hearing all the leaders of the world, the leaders of Ukraine, the business leaders of Ukraine coming together and trying to convince the audience that Ukraine was an important player in the future of innovation. And the thing that came back and back and back and back was the question of the storytelling of Ukraine, of the way Ukraine presents itself to the world. One of the things that was coming back all the time was what they call the 3C. So, and I didn't know about the 3Cs, but the 3Cs as corruption, Crimea, and Chernobyl. And everybody said, well, this is what Ukraine is known for: Crimea, the war, Chernobyl, of course, and corruption. And to me, I see exactly the opposite when I come to Ukraine. I don't hear too much about Chernobyl, and this is a problem that is taken care of. I don't see that much about corruption, and I will come back to this because I think this is a very important point. And definitely Crimea is not something we talk about every day, and we see every day in Kyiv. So we feel we're in a very safe environment. So we have to change the storytelling. And I think this is a key component of the reputation of the country. And I think the reputation of the country is not where it should be. You know, a lot of people told me a story, or not a story, something you tell when people move to Ukraine. You cry when you move, you cry when you leave. And you know, I mean, I feel it after moving here. I mean, I was not ecstatic about moving to Ukraine from San Francisco, right? And now I'm like, I will never go back to San Francisco. So I think there is something like this. And I would like to insist in one point that actually Charles mentioned, but that I think is playing a much bigger role than we think. It's the Ministry of Digital Transformation, actually. So Ukraine is the only country in the world where the number two of the government, number two, is Deputy Prime Minister, is the Minister of Digital Transformation. The guy is 28. He comes from a startup company, and he's surrounded by girls and guys. Actually, it's pretty diverse in his team that are about his age, and they're creating a startup within the government. And what they did in 18 months is amazing. And one of the effects of this is fighting the daily corruption. When you digitalize everything, especially your interaction with the administration, there's no way you can give a penny here and there to bribe someone, because everything is digitalized. And so there's no money exchange. And you don't see it. So you don't see it when you're arrested on the street and you got a ticket. You don't see it when you interact with the administration. That changes completely the dynamic, because that introduces transparency where there was none. And I think that's one of the beauty of the transformation. The second thing it does is, and I think it's very important for Ukraine actually, and we will see this with UNIT.City, which is basically a digital environment for tech companies. We don't know, or we haven't seen in the history, any tech ecosystem developing without the support of the government. It's true in Silicon Valley, we know it, it's well documented. It's of course true in Israel, we know it, it's well documented. If we look at how France actually is becoming more and more digital, it's also because of the strong involvement of the French government and the public bank system, BPI, which is investing billions in the tech industry. We don't have that money in Ukraine. We just don't. We have the Ukraine Startup Fund that is actually, I think, an extremely interesting tool. And we have the Minister of Digital Transformation, who is trying to approach this from a very different angle, which is how can we support the population becoming more digital? And all of a sudden, startups become cool. Startups become important. Startups become useful. And people see the use for that. And to me, I think this is a very important tool that we don't actually estimate enough in this current administration. We see a lot of problems in this administration, like in any administration, but this is something that is working and that is delivering. Actually, that is maybe even over delivering. Ukraine is now the first country in the world with an electronic passport. The first. It's the fourth country in the world with an electronic driving license. We don't have that in the US. We don't have that in France. We don't have that but we have it in Ukraine. And so I think we see the opportunity of the country to leapfrog in many things, and yes. So those are the few comment I have, and I would like to comment also on Ukraine is not creative, which is also something that is very shocking to me because I think exactly the opposite. But once again, I really think there is a huge storytelling issue. I will take an industry that is not the tech industry, but that is a fashion industry. And actually in fashion, we see in Ukraine incredible designers, incredible world-class designers. They could be Dior, they could be Louis Vuitton, they could be world-class designer. They have a really hard time accessing a global market, and they have a really hard time scaling their businesses for many reasons. I will not go into details, but they have the talents. And the question is, how do we support them to go global, to reach a global market? For fashion, it's absolutely obvious to me. It's very clear. It has a global potential, but I see the same with tech. I see exactly the same with tech and tech startup. They have the potential to become global. Now we have to work on the storytelling. We really have to work on the storytelling. So maybe those are very quickly my 2 cents on this, and yeah.
Yeah, and if I can, Mike, just
Yeah, go ahead, Chuck.
I agree completely with Dominic. It is a storytelling question. And what's funny about this is I've been in rooms with people who are Ukrainian and part of the Ukrainian diaspora, and I am probably the most aggressively positive about Ukraine in the room. And I wonder sometimes why that is. And again, I think part of it is there's a history here. Dominique and I, we're not part of that history. What we see is the world now, as opposed to the world 30 years ago. And it may be difficult for some folks to separate the two. The world today is really very different. I've had friends that come in from San Francisco, actually, to Ukraine. And they will tell me this is pre-Amazon Silicon Valley. This is early Silicon Valley, that they see all the elements, government support, young, creative, hard driving people, cool ideas, great startups. All the pieces are there. It just needs to kind of coalesce. And the bridge that Dominique was referring to, the ability to take them from Ukraine and bring them to the globe, needs to be finalized. But all the pieces are there. And so there's no reason why, for those who perhaps are a little bit more tied to the history, that they shouldn't perhaps take a step back. And maybe it's incumbent upon us to think more about the storytelling process, but to make them better understand that the Ukraine today, the Ukraine over the last 5 years, really has dramatically changed.
And so both of you emphasize this idea of storytelling and telling the story better. How can we connect with the media, the global media, the media in Western Europe, the media in the United States, and so forth, particularly the business media, to get that story across? Any thoughts on that?
I do have a few thoughts, actually. I do. I have two. The first one is what we're building here, UNIT.City, not pushing what I'm doing, but is actually an interesting idea. And I have to say, I come from the tech world. I'm a startup guy. And here I am, CEO of a real estate, actually one of the largest real estate company in Ukraine. I know nothing about real estate. This is not my business. This is not where I come from. And so what I'm trying to say is the main shareholder of UNIT.City is trying to do is to actually change the narrative. say, no, this is not real estate that I'm building. I'm building an ecosystem. I'm bringing something that is way bigger, and we're going to create bridges. And I think we need to see more of that, more of telling a bigger story of, we're not just building bridges and buildings and outsourcing company. We are building global vision with global mission to do something that is a little bit bigger. I think that the first thing. I think that the second thing is, I've been thinking a lot about Estonia, for example. And one of the things that is very successful in Estonia is Skype. And nobody really knows that Skype is from Estonia, and actually it doesn't really matter. What matters is that the founder of Skype decided to really massively give back to their country and help and support building this. And I think this is the story will change when we start to see maybe Ukrainian diaspora or very successful Ukrainian entrepreneur in the tech business. And then maybe those next unicorn, the Grammarly, the Preply, the People AI, who are one day going to exit. We need to start seeing them give back. And those are wonderful, positive global stories that are making the press globally. If they start giving back to Ukraine and invest massively in Ukraine, this will completely change the narrative, because all of a sudden Ukraine has its heroes, its new Steve Jobs that the younger generation can identify to. Say, well, you know what? I don't want to be Steve Jobs. I want to be that guy who created Grammarly, or that guy who created PetCube. And then you start forming a new culture and a new generation. And I think we need to see that. Then the press will see those stories.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We do have some press that happens now, but it is somewhat sporadic. And I think the difference between the press we've seen now and the press that Dominique is describing is it will be driven by real concrete results.
Yeah.
And we're beginning to see this. That's the interesting thing. They are already there. Again, I'll pat myself on the back a little bit, right? AO has done fairly well in bringing companies into the global markets. Our aggregate implied valuation for the first 15 months of our existence is something like $27 million. We've gotten some really, really great investments, some really great grants, and we have some incredibly strong teams. It's early stage, right? But it's definitely there. The Grammarlys are there, the People AIs, the folks who have done quite well for Ukraine are beginning to look back to Ukraine. We're seeing it in terms of big entrepreneurs. We're seeing it in terms of smaller entrepreneurs. And so we've got sort of the basic press coverage. There are articles in the Financial Times on Ukraine, Davos, right? The Ukraine House. But as we see more and more of this kind of, the completion of the cycle, people who have done well coming back and reinforcing the system, you're going to see a lot more beginning to hit the press. And because the components are already there, right? The pieces of the new economy are already there. I think it's going to gel together very fast. This is not something that it's like you need a lightning strike, right? And everything will gel together relatively fast, and make Ukraine, I think, a much stronger tech source, a global hub.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank both of you for a very lively discussion today and some very interesting thoughts about these misconceptions about Ukraine and tech. And hopefully we all can make some changes.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is Mike Burek, your host and producer of On the Digital Media, presented by the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, a webcast series about the people of Ukraine and their contributions to global technology innovation. Until next time, that's all for now.